Sups, everybody! I am Mr. Sups, back with more Evolutions of Video Games homework. Alright, let's start with the lecture recap. So, last week we discussed Nintendo's rise and the Sega's Genesis and all that. And this week we went more in-depth into those topics. As I said last time, the Big End was not unopposed in their ascension, and the biggest thorn in their side was Atari. Atari was under new management. They had a Japanese businessman as their president, and they had a couple of legal battles with Nintendo around this time period. The first was over Nintendo's control on what could and could not get on the NES. Now, Atari had this huge back catalog that they would like to get onto the system, but Nintendo, kind of wary of the oversaturation that happened, a couple years prior, only allowed 5 games to come out per studio per year. 10 if you cheesed it with some shell companies. So Atari didn't like this, and they tried to hack the NES security to circumvent that. All the while, they were suing Nintendo over having a monopoly over the game industry. The second big legal battle was over the one, the many, the best-selling video game of all time, Tetris. When Alexei Pyatov's simple puzzle game caught on, people everywhere wanted to get a piece of that. And it kind of got weird at that point because it was developed in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And they really didn't have good copyright control, and licensing issues and stuff arise due to capitalism, socialism, all that 80s stuff. And in the end, Atari, through their subsidiary shell company, Tengen, as I said, they cheesed it a lot, and Nintendo both thought they had the rights to make Tetris and put it on the NES. In both cases, the Big N won out. They had a much better legal team, much better paperwork in the process, and a modicum of foresight. They got the worldwide rights for Tetris rather than just the NES rights. So, Nintendo won. And Atari, again, kind of got its crap kicked in. So with the Atari and Nintendo stuff out of the way, another competitor arises, the Genesis. When Sega came around with that thing, it came hard. It had 2 very good marketing people. One, Michael Katz, who coined the phrase, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." And Tom Kalinske, who coined the phrase, "Give away the razors to sell the blades." That means you sell the console at a loss for very cheap, so people would buy more games for it and you would make more money off the games. Which is a marketing strategy that continues to this day. And then Sega had Sonic come out, and they became a force to be reckoned with. Nintendo, yeah, they weren't worried, because they recently came out with the Game Boy, and it had Tetris on it, so they were raking in the cash, and the Super Nintendo was in development. So they were good, but their dominance was shaken. And now, video games weren't very niche at all. They had hundreds of millions of people playing them, as we move on to the 16-bit war in the next class. With the recap over, on to the discussion. The discussion this week was to analyze if experimentation still happens in the industry today. Some may say no, I personally say yes, which is why I used Mark of the Ninja, which is probably the first stealth game to use the side view as my b-roll. We were supposed to find 2 sources for the discussion. First, I chose an extra credits video on innovation. In it, it describes the widening gap that's happening in game development today. Then, on one side, we have AAA games, which are these massively budgeted, massive games that are rather safe. And then you have indie games, which are these smaller games with a smaller budget, but tend to be a lot more experimental. Sometimes. And the reasoning why is because the AAA games, their games cost so much to make, and the price is just getting higher and higher, that they want a very, very safe investment, and they'll rarely experiment. While indies, their budgets can charitably be described as minimal. and will often experiment because they have so little to use, so they have they have so little to use, they have little to lose. My tongue. And sometimes they'll just experiment out of simple necessity with their lack of resources. And when their experiment proves successful, they tend to be appropriated into a lot more AAA games. A good example comes from, like, Braid, which was a very interesting sort of time puzzle platformer thing, and after that, a lot of games did have a lot of time manipulation mechanics. The second source I used was an extra punctuation article on two game developers. Suda51, whose game No More Heroes can be described as Devil May Cry starring Johnny Knoxville, and Swery65, who created Deadly Premonition, which is the closest thing we'll ever get to a Twin Peaks video game. Now, the article goes into how absolutely bonkers the games are in terms of gameplay and storytelling, and are very weird. There's nothing else like them. But when it comes down to their quality, they're a bit iffy. And how a lot of games, a lot of very independent or experimental games, often use that experimentation as a shield to deflect criticism. It's like, oh, we're trying to break the monotony, so we can't be all bad. They actually do have a point. That experimentation does break the monotony, but it's not always good, and sometimes a safer game is a lot more enjoyable than something experimental.